Post-Terran Contact, late 2667. J. Kurt. The day following his evening with Cameron was relatively smooth. The local processing station was the primary facility to process all who wished to join the armed forces. It was a place made to solidify paperwork and acted as the final step before your training would begin. He did as Staff Sergeant Cooper said and provided the folder he was given. As fate would have it, they expedited his ship date to tomorrow instead of one that would have been much later. He did various physical tests to determine the full range of motion or any possible liabilities that would prove detrimental to their job. Behind closed doors were more invasive interviews with medical professionals, but after trudging the slow process, Jay finally came out from the facility in a holding area. There, he met with Cameron and Moran. "Hey, Jay!" Moran greeted along with a meek Cameron. "How are you?" asked Cameron. "Never better, although it feels like I'm moving a bit too fast." "That's natural. My date was set just before I graduated high school," Moran inserted. "Today was my finalization." "Same here, except mine was 3 weeks ago," Cameron added, raising 3 fingers of his right hand. "So what's this place? Looks like holding area," inquired Jay. "It is," Moran started. "From here we'll go to the nearest starport, where they already have rooms reserved for us. Then tomorrow, we'll all take commercial transport to the Raider Recruit Depot," he explained. The 3 started a casual conversation while the room began to fill. The capacity was fit for 2,000 personnel, but their room was filled to only half that amount. The time came when the doors to the facility closed behind them and the doors to their front opened, revealing a tram rail. Each compartment was able to hold 75 people, and there was a total of 10 cars attached. The on-site personnel began shuffling the recruits into the cars, forcing them to cram into the limited space available. Many were stuck standing, and not long after the doors closed and the tram began moving, the smell of sweat began to permeate the car. Ventilation wasn't equipped to condition the overwhelming amount of people. Jay found himself with Cameron, as both were standing while Moran was able to land a seat and was already well on his way to falling asleep. The ride itself was anxiety-inducing for many, and their car was rising in volume from many of the recruits as they began to talk among one another, each sharing their stories and where they came from. Jay and Cameron did the same. They spoke in length bits of their childhood, with Cameron excited to listen to Jay, who seemed to have experienced a storied past, including the most recent past. They continued talking until the automated announcer said that they were nearing the Alta starport. They exited the tram when the doors opened and were greeted by several tables further toward the station's entrance. Each person was given an identification number that they used to determine room keys, and all were lined up. Jay looked around and noticed that many wore only the clothes on their backs and what little they could have in their pockets and their paperwork. When it was their turn at the desk, they gave their number and were given their room keys. Moran ended up rooming with the person in front of him, and Jay and Cameron found themselves as roommates. It was now late afternoon, and Moran left with his roommate, and so did the pair. Their room was designed in minimalist fashion with a mix of white, gold, and silver that made simple shapes and paired with abstract placed teal. It wasn't his first choice of design, but he wasn't paying for the room, so he let it go. They were told before receiving their room keys that they were free to explore the station's public areas for food and legal entertainment. So he did what the others were doing and took Cameron with him for food with Moran not in sight. "How far do you think it is from here to the depot?" asked Cameron, biting into a burger. Jay did some calculations using personal reference before answering. "From the Alta system, I'd say about 3 weeks in one go." "In slip space?" Cameron blurted. Jay nodded. "Yeah, the commercial ships these days have a faster drive core, and my ship would have taken about 1.5 months. Cameron was surprised. "What did you do during those times in between systems? Physical training? My ship could only travel to the next nearest system before I could jump again, so I've spent a lot of time in space than I wanted to." "Well, I can see your progress," Cameron said, pointing to his arms weren't large, but they were toned. "No wonder you did well on your PT scores." Jay laughed, taking a solemn bite out of a custom-ordered burrito. He stared at it and quickly finished it. "I have a habit of gorging on food when I was stressed, and working out helped alleviate that, for what it's worth it." He ended their conversation and left for the room, with Cameron quickly following. The sooner they slept, the sooner the next day came. When his head hit the pillow, Jay was quick to fall to slumber, with Cameron following suit shortly after. The following 3 weeks were over before Jay knew it. because when they entered the ship, instead of riding out the 3 weeks awake, they were placed in cryogenic pods, and the next they knew it, the recruits were less than a day out from their destination, Mars. In the central passenger compartment was a hologram of the current system. It was Saul, and it was the first time he had traveled here. From the information he read when he was younger, it was the most populated system with an extremely high presence of Navy ships and orbital stations. Almost every planet and moon was colonized, and many found their homes there. There were even 2 large communities of those who lived in the system's asteroid belts as major mining colonies. Even Mars was terraformed at the end of the 21st century, and since then had seen exponential growth in terraforming technology with Mars as the basis. Therefore, in the early 23rd century, planets that had similar conditions to Mars could be terraformed after a generation or 2. However, very few planets could be terraformed since the cost of the technology had yet to be opened to private industry. The planet had large 2 sizable polar ice caps with the northern pole, with the largest area of the 2, and was placed in the center of its northern hemisphere ocean. The southern hemisphere was a connected supercontinent with 2 large bodies of water as large as lakes. They were now just a few hours away from touching down, and Jay grew nervous. He left to explore the mess deck and found that they provided pre-made burritos. He bought 4 and returned to Cameron, who was still recovering from cryosleep. He offered one to his friend while eating the 3 left over. Jay noticed Cameron looking around for who he assumed to be Moran and found him near the front, engaging with a group of males in a card game. Not wanting to move, Cameron stayed where he was and slowly ate his burrito. By now, Jay was on his 3rd and final one when a notice came over the intercom. "Return to your seats and fasten your harness for the descent." Those that were up and about did as they were told, and all the seats in the bay quickly filled. The ship rocked at first, but smoothed out throughout the descent. Jay looked out the window to his right, and he figured they were just below the stratosphere. The ground below was green and heavily forested. Several locations could be seen as worker settlements or military installations, with some areas close enough to eye the large ships parked above. Others began to peer into the windows to view the ships outside. The most notable was the Chimera-class destroyers and Artemis-class heavy frigates. Their silhouettes screamed stellar fleet, and they were the most numerous. Their bows were similar in construction with a top and bottom portion, with a space in the middle, looking like a rectangular jaw from a side profile. However, the destroyers were complete in their frame, and these boasted space in the center of the ship and throughout the engines. The line of small, medium, and heavy frigates shared the same frontal design, but toward the aft, it had 2 side outcrops that ran the center part of the ship. The engines also boasted angled, reinforced hulls that covered the top and bottom portions of the sides of the ship and engines. There was also an extended bay at the bottom of the frigates to allow quick offload and download of vehicles and other cargo. Their names were too far to make out, but strips of color appeared on the aft section of the reinforced hulls. The destroyers had a crimson-colored stripe that ran down the sides of the bow and aft sections of the ships, and the frigates were colored yellow, green, and blue, respectively of their sizes. So it was no wonder the passengers were in a roar. This was the first time they had seen TRSC ships in person, no matter how far they seemed. The ship had finally descended, and the once rambunctious crowd was now silent as the void they had just traveled. The doors of the ship were open, and Jay looked for the source of the sudden silence. That was until they made themselves known. "Get off my ship!" a man in a similar uniform worn by Staff Sergeant Cooper 3 weeks ago yelled. Except on his head, he wore a wide circular brim hat. "Move, move, move, move!" they yelled, followed by several more sporting the same uniform. They rushed to the passenger compartment and began screaming at those who didn't move quickly enough. Jay nudged at Cameron, and the 2 followed the mass of people trying to exit all at once, while they were constantly yelled at. They made their way off, and their large group was now rendered to 10, and all were formed in 4 columns. When all was set, Jay looked beneath him and noticed a set of black footprints spread at a 45-degree angle. "Listen here," a lead uniformed man screamed, his voice multiplied by a series of speakers. "The footprints you stand on are the symbol of the training you will undergo and what you will become. Thousands have stood where you are, and only hundreds have been able to call themselves raiders for every cycle." He began to list off a series of rules and regulations to be followed, such as only responding with "yes sir" or "no sir," and what is expected. When the rules were explained, one at a time, The groups were shuffled toward the nearest building. When they were clear, the next group followed, and so on, until his group was ordered to move. He felt a tug behind him and noticed Cameron was with him while looking for Moran, whom he noticed was near the front, while Jay and Cameron were situated near the back. The building they entered was another holding bay. This time, buses awaited on the side. All recruits were stationary in their seats, and their voices were silenced. As the buses came, the groups slowly diminished until each was on a bus toward a facility out in the distance. They weren't allowed to raise their heads and were told to keep quiet on the ride. As each moment passed, all Jay could think was, why did he join? When they arrived at the depot, their bus was corralled into a large warehouse and ran through a series of other recruits that handed them 2 large green bags and were issued their gear that was ungraciously tossed into the bag. This continued until all recruits were confirmed to have their gear, and they proceeded to their first initial sleeping quarters, where they were told that the initial week was administration and paperwork processing. Throughout the week, and with many more on the horizon, they were yelled at and forced to do arbitrary and repetitive actions. By now, they were donning the standard gray and black camouflage pattern battle dress uniform and a pair of running shoes. Their hair was unevenly shaven, with some having patches of unshaven fuzz if a hand ran across their scalp. Everywhere they went, they marched, as sloppy as it was. They were now under the instruction of a single instructor that didn't yell often, and for most of the week, all he did was raise his voice to get the newly formed platoon's attention. However, that would change on Friday. As their initial week finished, they were ushered to a large 5-story building and placed into a large bay with 3 rows of bunk beds that created 2 medium-sized pathways. The recruits were immediately rushed to find a bed and place their green bags on it, and to stand by near the front of the bay, which was called the quarterdeck, and it was the only place that could fit their platoon of approximately 102 recruits. They were issued to keep their heads down and to stand by. The footsteps could be heard from a door near the front of the bay. Their attention was demanded, and their heads propped up to reveal a singular man in the foreground with 4 more behind him. All wore the same service uniform with the cover's brim shielding their eyes. Then the frontman spoke. "Listen up, you unwanted and God-forsaken maggots. I am Gunnery Sergeant Slaughter, and I, along with my fellow drill instructors, will be your worst fucking nightmare. And I will not be the last. My goal here is to ensure you are trained to the best of our abilities. To become the most feared warriors with the death wish that humanity has to offer, to be willing to jump into danger for the sake of not just your brethren, but to which the Republic serves. Your family's friends. Your fucking girlfriend is now screwing your best friend, and if not him, then your neighbor." Slaughter paced the area near the front of the group before continuing. "Let me introduce you to your instructors." From left to right, they stepped in practice and in fluid motion at the mention of their rank and name. When he was done, they returned to their spot and remained at parade rest, their feet apart and their hands across the lower part of their back. "You are mine, and you are theirs. You will respect them for the duty and title that they hold, to train the next generation of raiders, but right now, you are nothing but useless recruits, nothing but a piece of shit on the bottom of my boot." He paused and looked about the room. "Drill instructors." He paused, taking his spot behind the 4 previously named instructors. "You have them!" As soon as his final word left his mouth, chaos erupted. The 4 drill instructors began issuing orders rapidly, and many were already stumbling at what they called for. The orders were simple, but consisted of incoherent screams that generated a man-made fog of war for the recruits. However, now their beds were. The orders were simple but consisted of incoherent screams that generated a man-made fog of war for the recruits. However, now their beds were made, and any extra gear not needed was placed in the footlocker at the foot of the racks. Jay was breathing quickly, and looked to Cameron, who was now his rackmate. He had a visible look of fear and anxiety on his face. The orders continued until nightfall. They had gotten dinner, and they showered, all under the supervision of their instructors, so each meal was no more than 15 minutes, and their showers were no more than them walking through the showerheads in ice-cold water. When all was said and done, they were allowed to sleep, and few throughout the night would stand an hour of watch, subject to the random and sudden orders of the drill instructors. However, Jay would be able to sleep without having to stand watch, and was able to enjoy some modicum of rest. However, each morning they were awoken, but the sudden illumination of fluorescent lighting and the yells of their instructors, Liates, slights, and they would be subject to a series of repetitive motions and a constant yell of affirmation whenever one is spoken to. This would continue in the mornings and evenings until lights out. Between physical training and classes, it remained the same routine until their time at the range. The range was a series of activities that were a mix of shooting, land navigation, the gas chamber, and a culminating event at the end shrouded in mystery. For shooting, all recruits were taught from the ground up, even if they had experienced it prior. They were able to pick up quickly on the theory and practice in little time compared to a city boy whose only time with a gun was online in a game. The weapon you hold is the standard weapon of the armed forces. It is the KTAC S8AR, your gas-operated, shoulder-fired, magazine-fed weapon of choice. Slaughter explained, "This will be your friend, lover, and child. It may very well be the one you use when you exit your steel coffin in the middle of an enemy squad that was unfortunate enough to get in your way. Oorah! Oorah!" The platoon screamed in unison. Jay showed some aptitude and scored relatively midpoint, making a sharpshooter. Cameron, on the other hand, made marksman, a tier just below sharpshooter, with expert being the highest. Moran scored expert and flaunted it amongst his newfound group. "Is expert really that great?" Cameron said, his voice gravelly from the constant yelling over the past several weeks. Jay shrugged. "It tells them that you know how to control your weapon and that you can hit your mark," he said, as he pulled on the rifle's charging handle and loaded a round into the chamber. They were now testing in the final target acquisition and speed reload test. For this next test, they had 10 seconds to fire, reload, and fire again. They started in an alert stance, and when the buzzer alarmed, Jay brought his rifle up, lined the shot, and fired 2 rounds when the bolt locked. With a practiced motion, pressed the magazine release with his trigger finger and, with his free left hand, simultaneously grabbed the second magazine, loaded it, sent the bolt forward, and fired 2 more shots. He put his weapon on the safe, lowered his weapon, maintained the muzzle down range, and looked left and right. Cameron had just fired his second volley when the buzzer sounded. "Unload show clear!" The instructors sounded, and the recruits compiled in a similar cadence. The totals were tallied, and Jay scored 334 points out of 350. He made mid an expert. Cameron, on the other hand, made 304, a high sharpshooter. Cameron was visibly dejected after their scores were totaled, and he felt bad for those who made marksmen. When they returned to the barracks, those that made 279 and below were promptly hazed in the name of incentivized training. Some Jay was subject to when he failed to be quick enough with holding a back in the air or his uniform wasn't on all the way. There could be any number of reasons they could pull you aside and proceed to torment you while the rest of the platoon watched, not wanting to share their fate. It did well to stay in line and do as you were told. "I meant to ask," Cameron started, when the platoon was given an hour to themselves before overlights out. "What happened to your face?" A red mark in the shape of a stocky worm was present under his eye. "I didn't secure my lock to my footlocker for the first time yesterday, so Gunny Slaughter made sure I didn't do it again. And you can bet I'm not doing that again." He said with a wry laugh 12 weeks had passed since then, and Jay and Cameron were subject to another 12 weeks of the depot. However, the punishment lessened greatly when his platoon was swapped to a new series of instructors. Instead of calling them sir and ma'am, they were now called by their rank. However, Gunny Slaughter remained constant and enforced their drills early on, but now was more focused on training them as a team. While Slaughter was the acting company commanding officer, he was Jay's platoon's senior instructor. Over the next 11 weeks, the hotel company was trained in various other weapon platforms and advanced tactics. They were thoroughly ingrained with the knowledge of clearing buildings and fighting in all terrain. Even more so, they trained as a team, and the squad leader led instruction in tactics and simulated combat. This continued until the night on the eve of their culminating event. "You think you're ready, Cameron?" Jay asked as he drew on a mini notepad. "I think so. It's much better knowing I have you to count on," he replied as he was clearing his uniform of stray fabric. "If anything, I'll carry you to the finish line," Jay said with a smirk, to which Cameron replied quietly, "I hope that won't be the case." The night continued, and hotel company was met with an early morning. 10 platoons formed outside their barracks. What was now 1,000 recruits was now down to just above half. Those who failed to meet the expected standards were sent away to a following company that would soon take their place in the field. That was their last chance to make it as a raider, but even then, Once they were dropped for a third time, they were sent home. Still, they awoke and gathered their gear and rifles. Their final test as recruits were now upon them. The final test took place during the final week. It was as much a test as it was a 3-day-long obstacle course. They were informed near the beginning that the final event was a large-scale exercise that utilized simulation rounds, also known as simunition, as they made their way through the course. Before they would begin, a brief was held by Gunnery Sergeant Slaughter. "You men have done a good job in coming this far. I am almost proud of what shit stains you all were." The recruits laughed at his joke, and he continued. "Before these gates are a series of trucks, each for a platoon, that will take you to predetermined locations around the outskirts of the training arena. This is the final test. Those who make it can call themselves raiders. Those who fail will get dropped," he said, pausing for dramatic effect. "These are the rules. 1. You'll have exactly 72 hours to reach the final point, your graduation. 2. You must be equipped with simunition rounds designed to paralyze the target. The suits you wear will register it. All who make it by the deadline will graduate, conscious or not. The 4th and final rule is you will not kill, only incapacitate." The air stilled, and all 10 platoons were silent. They had experienced 12 weeks of abuse and hazing, while also being nurtured in the ways and knowledge of a warrior. They were not going to give up now. "A final word. You will also share the arena with 2 other companies from another depot competing to graduate. We have drilled into every bit of leadership and combat instinct you need to get you through this. Make it to the top and prove to them you are superior." He looked left and right, his visage on screens to the outermost lying platoons. "Then, drill instructors, direct these recruits to their transport." Upon taking their spot on the truck, each was ceremoniously given a yellow band to place over their arm. They were accompanied by their drill instructors, but they only acted as supervisors from overhead in an Odin, a troop transport modified with the capability of surveillance and a capacity to pull any out that have been stunned for too long. Cameron and Jay sat across one another in the truck, and for the duration of the ride, the passengers conversed, and the squad leaders drew up strategies for the 72-hour trail. Moran was one such squad leader. Each was given a vague map of the training area with several marked and unmarked roads. They were also given only 3 packs of MREs each and 2 water canteens. They were donning a Raider cuirass and an orbital guard trooper helmet painted in the steel gray of their overall uniform. They were told that if they could walk for 3 days straight, the trip would take only 25 hours. They had to manage sleep, obstacles, and an unknown enemy combatant. Each truck of their company was driven off to separate locations, and the same was meant for the other 2 companies. "I heard the other companies graduating are Gulf and India. They'll be wearing blue and green. So if you see them, either let them pass or take them out," one squad leader suggested. His name taped on his helmet and chest indicated he was named Gale. "The less competition we have to the top, the better. I say we shoot," rebuked Moran. The 2 squad leaders duke out their ideas while the rest just watched, conversing about likely scenarios and how to deal with them when the trucks come to a stop. Their platoon was separated into 4 squads and thus took 2 trucks to reach their destination. They stood before a large gate with a large and thick concrete wall that extended far into the trees. The squads organized themselves so each squad would enter the gate on order. Moran was in charge of Squad 1, while Jay and Cameron were in Squad 2. "You ready for this, Cam?" Jay said with a nudge of his elbow. "Cam? You've never called me that before," he said, cocking his head to the side in a confused look. "I think it would be fitting. You've only called me by first name, but I've never heard yours." His face was flush red from embarrassment, probably. "Promise you won't laugh?" "Promise." All right." A buzz rang, and the large doors opened, revealing a wide dirt path. The trail was open on the sides, with trees lining the edge of the open area, and a series of buildings could be seen on the horizon. The timer buzzed once more, revealing a countdown, and the first squad departed, soon to be followed by the rest, and Cameron finally replied, "It's Camille."
TRSC trial by fire. Report. Detecting a slip space rupture in the outer edge of the Draxis system. Rupture matches the description and readings by the TRSC Will-O-the-Wisp. Moving forces to engage the hostile threat. Forces engaged. Hostile is a lone frigate. Hostile self-destructed. Receive transmission before destruction. Data downloaded. Athena report awaiting. Recipients notified. Athena, TRSC Sword of Reckoning.